scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. The day started like any other in the Pig family household. But something felt different from the moment Peppa woke up. The sunlight streaming through her bedroom window seemed dimmer than usual, casting long shadows that moved independently of the clouds outside. When she looked at her alarm clock, the hands were spinning backwards, yet somehow she knew exactly what time it was. George was already awake in his room, but he wasn't playing with his usual dinosaur toys. Instead, he was having a conversation with someone Peppa couldn't see. She could hear his little voice through the wall, asking questions and pausing as if listening to responses. When she pressed her ear against the wall, she could almost make out another voice answering him, but it sounded like it was coming from very far away. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was preparing breakfast, but the kitchen looked different. The familiar yellow walls seemed to shift between colors when no one was looking directly at them. The refrigerator hummed a melody that sounded almost like a lullaby, but the tune was slightly off, making it feel unsettling rather than comforting. When Mummy Pig opened the refrigerator door, cold mist poured out like fog, and for just a moment, she thought she saw tiny figures moving inside among the food. Daddy Pig was in the garden, but he wasn't doing his usual gardening. He was standing perfectly still, staring at a spot in the ground where nothing seemed to be growing. When Peppa called to him from the window, he turned around slowly, and his smile seemed wider than it should be. He waved at her with movements that were just a little too mechanical, like a wind-up toy running down. At breakfast, the family sat around the table, but their reflections in the window behind them didn't quite match their movements. When Peppa reached for her juice, her reflection reached for something else entirely. George's reflection seemed to be eating something different from what was on his plate, and their parents' reflections appeared to be having a completely different conversation than the one happening at the table. The telephone rang during breakfast, but when Daddy Pig answered it, there was no one on the other end, just silence. But if you listened very carefully, you could hear what sounded like breathing, and occasionally a whisper that might have been someone saying their names. Each time the phone rang after that, it rang exactly 13 times before stopping, even when someone tried to answer it. Peppa decided to go outside to play, but the playground looked strange. The swings were moving gently back and forth even though there was no wind, and the slide seemed longer than it used to be. When she climbed to the top, she could see much further than she ever had before, all the way to places that didn't look familiar, with houses that seemed to be built upside down and trees that grew downward into the sky. George joined her outside, but he brought his dinosaur toys, and they were behaving oddly. The plastic dinosaurs seemed to be watching everything with their painted eyes, and when George wasn't looking directly at them, they appeared to change positions slightly. The toy T-Rex's mouth seemed to open and close as if it was trying to say something important. The neighbors started coming outside too, but they all moved in perfect synchronization, like they were following the same invisible conductor. Mrs. Rabbit waved from her garden, but her wave continued for much longer than a normal wave should, and her smile never changed. Mr. Bull was mowing his lawn in perfectly straight lines, but the grass he had already cut seemed to be growing back immediately behind him. As the day progressed, the family noticed that their shadows were acting independently. Peppa's shadow would sometimes point in different directions than her finger, and George's shadow appeared to be playing with shadow toys that George wasn't actually holding. Mummy and Daddy Pig's shadows seemed to be having their own private conversation, gesturing and moving in ways that didn't match what their owners were doing. The house itself began to feel alive. Doors would creak open just a crack when no one was near them, and footsteps could be heard in empty rooms. The grandfather clock in the hallway started chiming at random intervals, sometimes playing melodies instead of simple chimes. The pictures on the walls seemed to watch the family as they moved through the house, and occasionally, someone in a photograph would appear to blink. When evening came, the family gathered to watch television, but every channel showed the same thing. Their own house, filmed from impossible angles. They could see themselves sitting in the living room, but the version on TV was slightly different. The TV family's movements were delayed by just a few seconds, and sometimes the TV family would do things that the real family hadn't done yet. As night fell, the stars outside arranged themselves into patterns that spelled out words, but the words kept changing before anyone could read them completely. The moon seemed closer than usual, and its face appeared to be watching the house with great interest. Street lights flickered in a rhythm that almost sounded like Morse code, sending messages to anyone who might be listening. The family went to bed, but sleep felt different. Their dreams seemed to blend together, and they found themselves sharing the same strange visions of floating through rooms that were bigger on the inside than the outside, and meeting versions of themselves that lived in a world where everything was just slightly wrong. In the morning, everything returned to normal, but each family member secretly wondered if the normal world was real, or if the strange day had been the real one, and this was just another dream that they were all sharing together. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly normal Wednesday morning when Peppa arrived at playgroup. The sun was shining, and everything seemed just as it should be. Peppa skipped through the front door, excited to see her friends. Madame Gazelle greeted the children with her usual warm smile, but something felt different today. Her eyes seemed to linger on each child a moment too long, and her smile stretched wider than normal. The classroom looked the same, but the atmosphere felt heavy. As the children settled into their seats, Peppa noticed that Susie Sheep was sitting unusually still. Her best friend, who was always chattering, hadn't said a single word. When Peppa waved at her, Susie turned her head slowly, mechanically. Her expression had been replaced by something blank and empty. Pedro Pony and Rebecca Rabbit also seemed different. One by one, Peppa looked around and realized that all her friends were sitting in perfect silence, their eyes fixed straight ahead with glassy, vacant stares. Madame Gazelle began the lesson, but her voice sounded strange, deeper than usual with an odd echo. She was teaching about shapes, but the shapes on the board began to move and twist. Circles became spirals, squares stretched into impossible rectangles. Peppa raised her hand to ask a question, but when she opened her mouth, no sound came out. She tried again, but still nothing. Looking around frantically, she realized that she was the only one who seemed concerned. The classroom began to feel smaller, the walls seeming to inch closer. The cheerful drawings on the walls started to change. The smiling suns developed too many teeth. The happy flowers wilted and turned black, and the rainbow lost its colors until only gray remained. Madame Gazelle's lesson continued, but now she was talking about things that didn't make sense. She spoke of numbers that went backwards and colors that had no names. Her voice grew louder and more distorted. Peppa tried to stand up, to run to the door, but her legs wouldn't obey her. She looked down and saw that her chair had somehow grown roots that wrapped around her ankles. The other children remained motionless. The windows, which had shown the bright playground, now revealed only darkness. The familiar sounds of children playing had been replaced by a low humming from the walls. Madame Gazelle turned to face the class, and Peppa saw that her teacher's kind eyes had been replaced by two perfect black circles. Her smile had grown impossibly wide, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. The lesson board now showed only one thing, the same drawing repeated over and over. It was a picture of the classroom with all the children in their circle, but there was an empty chair where Peppa should have been. Peppa finally found her voice and screamed, but the sound that came out wasn't her own. It was the voice of that other Peppa, laughing with a sound like breaking glass. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa woke up in her bedroom, but something felt different. The sunlight seemed dimmer than usual, casting strange shadows across her pink walls. As she got dressed, she noticed her reflection in the mirror was smiling even when she wasn't. Downstairs, Mummy Pig was making breakfast, but her movements were too mechanical. She turned to greet Peppa with a smile that stretched too wide, her eyes never blinking. Daddy Pig sat reading his newspaper, but the pages were completely blank, and he kept turning them anyway, chuckling at nothing. George was playing with his toy dinosaur, but it seemed to move on its own when no one was looking. Every time Peppa glanced away and looked back, the dinosaur had changed position, its plastic eyes following her movements. After breakfast, the family decided to visit Grandpa Pig's garden, but the journey felt endless. The same trees kept passing by the car window over and over, as if they were driving in circles. The radio played the same cheerful tune on repeat, but the melody began to sound distorted with each repetition. When they arrived at Grandpa Pig's house, he was standing perfectly still in his garden, staring at his vegetables. He had been watering the same tomato plant for hours, the water creating a muddy puddle that grew darker. When he turned to greet them, his smile was identical to Mummy Pig's unnaturally wide grin. The children went to play while the adults talked, repeating the same sentences over and over. Peppa and George found themselves drawn to an old shed that had never been there before. The door creaked open by itself, revealing nothing but darkness inside. As they peered into the shed, they heard their own voices calling from within the shadows, inviting them to play. The voices sounded exactly like theirs, but speaking words they had never said, promising games they had never played. Peppa grabbed George's hand and they ran back toward the house. But with each step, the distance grew longer. The house appeared to be moving away, and the sky began to darken despite being midday. When they reached the adults, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, and Grandpa Pig all turned with those same impossibly wide smiles. Their eyes had become completely black, reflecting nothing. They spoke in unison, asking if the children had enjoyed their visit to the shed. Peppa tried to speak about the voices and darkness, but her own voice came out wrong, sounding like someone else. George's toy dinosaur began to grow larger in his hands, its plastic becoming flesh, its painted smile becoming real teeth. The family got back in the car to go home, but the journey never ended. They drove through the same landscape over and over, past the same trees, houses, and people waving with those same wide, empty smiles. As night fell, they were still driving, and Peppa realized they would never stop, never reach home, never escape this endless loop. The radio continued its distorted tune, and everyone hummed along, their voices creating a harmony that sounded like nothing human. Driving for Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. The morning started like any other in the Pig family household. Peppa and George were playing in their garden while Mummy Pig prepared breakfast in the kitchen. The sun was shining brightly, and everything seemed perfectly normal. Daddy Pig was reading his newspaper on the porch, occasionally chuckling at something amusing. The familiar sounds of their happy home filled the air with warmth and comfort. But something was different about this particular morning. When Peppa looked at her reflection in the garden pond, she noticed that her reflection wasn't quite right. It moved a split second after she did, as if it was trying to copy her movements but couldn't keep up. When she waved her hand, the reflection waved back, but with a slight delay that made her stomach feel strange and uncomfortable. George noticed it too. His reflection in the pond seemed to be smiling even when he wasn't, showing teeth that looked sharper than they should be. The water itself began to ripple without any wind, creating patterns that looked almost like faces staring up at them from the depths. The children stepped back from the pond, but the reflections remained, watching them with eyes that seemed far too knowing. Inside the house, Mummy Pig called for breakfast, but her voice sounded different somehow. It echoed through the rooms in a way that didn't make sense, as if the house had suddenly become much larger than it actually was. When Peppa and George went inside, they found that the kitchen table was set for 6 people instead of 4, with 2 extra plates that no one had put there. The extra plates had food on them, but it was food that none of them remembered preparing. The meals looked exactly like what the family usually ate, but they were cold and seemed to have been sitting there for hours, maybe even days. Flies buzzed around the untouched portions, and there was a strange smell in the air that made everyone feel queasy. Daddy Pig tried to remove the extra plates, but every time he picked one up, it would reappear on the table as soon as he turned away. The family tried to eat their normal breakfast, but the food tasted wrong, like it had been seasoned with something bitter and metallic. Even their favorite orange juice had a strange aftertaste that lingered unpleasantly. As the day progressed, more strange things began to happen. The family photos on the wall started showing people who weren't part of their family. In each picture, there were additional figures standing behind them, shadowy forms that seemed to be reaching toward the camera. These mysterious figures appeared in every photo, even the ones that had been taken just yesterday. The telephone began ringing constantly, but whenever someone answered it, there was only silence on the other end. Sometimes, they could hear what sounded like breathing or whispers in a language they couldn't understand. The calls came every few minutes, creating a constant state of anxiety and unease throughout the house. By afternoon, the family realized that they couldn't leave their house. Every time they tried to open the front door, it would lead back into their own living room instead of outside. The windows showed their garden, but when they tried to open them, they found only solid walls behind the glass. They were trapped in their own home, which had somehow become a maze with no exit. The walls began to shift and change when no one was looking directly at them. Rooms would rearrange themselves, hallways would appear where there had been walls before, and familiar spaces would become foreign and threatening. The house seemed to be alive, breathing and changing around them, keeping them prisoner in an ever-shifting labyrinth. As evening approached, the family huddled together in what they hoped was still their living room. But even that familiar space felt wrong now. The furniture was the same, but everything was positioned slightly differently, as if someone had been rearranging things while they weren't paying attention. The house had become something else entirely, something that wore the appearance of their home like a disguise, hiding its true nature beneath a facade of normalcy that was becoming thinner with each passing hour. Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. It was a perfectly ordinary morning when Peppa and George woke up in their bedroom. The sun was shining through the yellow curtains, and everything seemed normal. Peppa stretched and yawned, ready for another fun day of jumping in muddy puddles. But when she looked over at George's bed, something was wrong. George was sitting up, but his eyes were completely black, staring at nothing. Peppa called out to him, but George didn't respond. Instead, he slowly turned his head toward her, and his mouth opened in an impossibly wide smile, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. His voice came out in a whisper that didn't sound like him at all. He kept repeating the same word over and over, but it wasn't dinosaur like usual. Frightened, Peppa ran downstairs to find Mummy and Daddy Pig. The living room looked the same as always, with its bright green walls and orange sofa, but the atmosphere felt heavy and wrong. Mummy Pig was standing in the kitchen, but she wasn't moving. She was just staring at the wall with that same black-eyed expression that George had. When Peppa approached her mother, Mummy Pig slowly turned around. Her usual warm smile had been replaced by something cold and mechanical. Her eyelashes seemed longer and darker, casting strange shadows across her face. She spoke in a voice that sounded like it was coming from far away, asking Peppa if she wanted to play a special game. Daddy Pig appeared from behind the newspaper he was reading, but his glasses reflected nothing but darkness. His beard seemed to move on its own, and when he laughed, it echoed through the house in a way that made Peppa's skin crawl. He suggested they all go to the playground, but the way he said it made it sound more like a command than a suggestion. At the playground, all of Peppa's friends were there, but they were different too. Susie Sheep stood motionless on the swings, Herwell looking gray and matted. Pedro Pony was at the slide, but he wasn't sliding down. He was just standing at the top, looking down at Peppa with those same empty black eyes that everyone else had. The playground equipment itself seemed to have changed. The bright colors had faded to dull, sickly shades. The swings creaked even when no one was on them, and the seesaw moved up and down by itself. The sandbox was filled with something that definitely wasn't sand, something dark that seemed to shift and move when no one was looking directly at it. Rebecca Rabbit hopped over to Peppa, but her movements were jerky and unnatural. When she spoke, her voice had a strange echo, and she kept inviting Peppa to come play in the dark sandbox. All the other children began to gather around Peppa, forming a circle, their black eyes never blinking. Peppa tried to run, but everywhere she went, more familiar faces appeared with those same dark, empty eyes. The ice cream van played its melody, but the tune was wrong, distorted and haunting. Mr. Zebra the postman delivered letters that were completely black, and when they touched the ground, they seemed to absorb the light around them. The sky began to darken even though it was still morning. The sun seemed to be getting smaller and dimmer, and strange shadows started moving across the ground without anything to cast them. The trees in the park began to sway even though there was no wind, and their leaves rustled with sounds that almost seemed like whispers. Peppa found herself back at home, but the house had changed. The walls seemed taller and the rooms felt endless. Every mirror she passed showed not her reflection, but the black-eyed versions of her family and friends, all smiling those terrible sharp-toothed smiles. The photographs on the walls had changed too, showing scenes that Peppa didn't remember, with everyone's eyes replaced by dark voids. In the final moments, Peppa realized she was the only one left who hadn't changed. She looked in the bathroom mirror and saw her own familiar pink face and normal eyes looking back at her. But as she watched, her reflection began to smile that same impossible smile, and slowly, very slowly, her eyes began to turn black. The last thing Peppa heard was her own voice, but it wasn't coming from her mouth. It was coming from the mirror, inviting her to join the others in their special game. And as the darkness finally took her, she realized that this wasn't a nightmare at all. This was just the beginning of a very different kind of Peppa Pig world, where everyone would smile forever.